petty officer asked the old janitor his call sign, until Dragon 6 lit up the command channel. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a quiet morning at the military base, the kind where the routine seemed endless. The low hum of machinery filled the air as soldiers and officers went about their duties. Among them, one figure stood out, an elderly janitor named James. He was a man who had seen more than his fair share of history, though you'd never guess by looking at him. His uniform was simple, a faded work shirt and pants, his back slightly hunched with age. He moved quietly through the halls of the base, pushing his cleaning cart with a deliberate pace. Most of the younger soldiers paid him no mind, dismissing him as just another old man, a relic of the past who had no place in the present military world. Today, however, things were about to change. As James passed by a group of young Marines, one of them, a cocky petty officer, looked at him with a smirk. "Hey, Grandpa," the officer called out. "What's your rank? You don't look like you belong here." The other Marines snickered, clearly enjoying the moment. James didn't flinch. He simply kept his gaze fixed ahead, not giving them the satisfaction of a response. The petty officer wasn't done yet. He took a few steps closer, hands on his hips. "Seriously, old man," he said, raising his voice. "What's your call sign? You think you're still some kind of soldier?" The other Marines laughed louder now, egging him on. But James didn't react. He remained calm, his movements slow but precise. The officer's tone grew more mocking. "Come on, give me your call sign. Tell me who you really are." James finally stopped pushing the cart and turned slightly toward the group, his voice low but steady. "Call sign. It doesn't matter anymore. But if you really want to know, it's Dragon 6. The words hung in the air for a moment, and the laughter from the Marines faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The petty officer raised an eyebrow. "Dragon 6? Seriously? You think that's gonna impress me?" He scoffed. "What are you, some kind of old war hero?" But before James could say anything further, something unexpected happened. A low hum of authority cut through the air. It wasn't the sound of a bass speaker or an officer walking by. It was the sound of something much more significant. A convoy of vehicles approached, the unmistakable rumble of military trucks filling the air. The young Marines froze, their attention now split between James and the approaching vehicles. The convoy screeched to a halt outside, and before anyone could react, the doors swung open, revealing a group of high-ranking officers. At the front of the group was a tall, imposing figure. The 4 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders reflected the sunlight as he stepped forward. It was General Alexander, a man whose name was spoken with the utmost respect across the military. His eyes scanned the scene before him, and they landed on James. The general's gaze softened for just a moment, recognizing the old man instantly. With a calm but commanding motion, the general walked toward James. The petty officer, who had been so eager to mock the elderly janitor, was now paralyzed with shock. The general stopped directly in front of James, his voice booming with a level of respect that silenced the entire area. "Dragon 6, it is an honor to see you again, sir." The words hit like a wave, and the younger Marines stared, dumbfounded. The general turned to the petty officer, his eyes narrowing with a sharp intensity. "You have no idea who you're talking to, do you?" he said, his voice cold. The petty officer stammered, unable to respond. The general's expression hardened as he continued. "This man, James, is not just some janitor. He is a living legend. A man who earned his call sign the hard way. A man who has saved more lives than you can count." The petty officer's face turned pale, and the Marines around him stood at attention, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. James simply smiled, his eyes glinting with quiet pride as the general saluted him. The entire base stood in silence as the general and James shared a moment of mutual respect, the younger Marines now fully aware of the true depth of the man they had just mocked. "I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Let me now proceed with the continuation of the story, ensuring the language and style are coherent with your request." The silence that followed General Alexander's words was thick, like the air before a storm. James, the elderly janitor, stood tall as ever, a calm smile playing on his lips. For the first time since his arrival at the base, he felt seen, truly seen, by the very people who had dismissed him moments ago. The young Marines, who had mocked him earlier, now stood rigidly at attention, their eyes wide with shock and awe. None of them had expected this sudden turn of events. They had thought James was just another old man who had wandered in from the civilian world, someone who didn't belong in the presence of active duty soldiers, let alone the revered General Alexander. But now they understood. James wasn't just some janitor. He was a war hero, a legend, and Dragon 6 was more than just a call sign. It was a symbol of bravery, sacrifice, and survival. The general didn't break his gaze from James, but turned to face the stunned group of Marines. This man, the general's voice rang out with authority, has been through battles you can only read about. His sacrifices have earned him the right to be here, and you, all of you, should be honored to be in his presence. The petty officer, still processing the weight of the general's words, felt a cold sweat run down his back. His arrogance, which had filled the air just moments ago, now felt like a distant memory, replaced with a crushing wave of embarrassment. The other Marines stood in silence, their faces pale, as they tried to wrap their heads around what they had just learned. "Sir, if you'll allow me," the general continued, turning back to James, "I have a message from an old friend." With that, the general reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. James's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the familiar handwriting. It was from a fellow soldier he hadn't heard from in years, a fellow member of the old unit. The letter, however, wasn't the most important part. It was the words written inside that carried the real weight. The letter read, "Dragon 6, the nation owes you more than it can ever repay. The battles we fought together, the men we saved, the lives we lost. I will never forget you." James's hands trembled slightly as he read the words, a lump forming in his throat. He had never sought recognition for his actions. For him, the mission was always more important than the medals or titles that came with it. The men he saved, the lives he protected, were his true legacy. "General," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the flood of memories rushing back, "you can tell him, I never did it for the recognition. I did it for the men who didn't make it home." The general nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the words. "I know, James, and that's what makes you a hero. Your humility is as legendary as your skill." For a brief moment, the base felt still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if giving space to this moment of reverence. The young Marines, now fully aware of the man they had belittled, could only stand there, silent, their respect for James growing by the second. The petty officer, who had once seen James as nothing more than an old janitor, now found himself standing in the presence of a true hero. His chest tightened with shame, and he knew, without a doubt, that he would never make that mistake again. "General," James said, his voice softer now, "it's been a long time since I've been called Dragon 6. I've earned my rest, but if it's still needed, I'll be here." The general smiled, a rare warmth in his expression. "Dragon 6, he said, "you've earned your rest, but the world is better when you're here. Rest assured, your legacy is alive and well." As the general and James shared a quiet moment, the rest of the Marines stood at attention, their hearts full of newfound respect. They had witnessed something that could never be erased from their memories, the truth of who James was and what he had done. From that day forward, every time they walked past James, the janitor, they would remember the weight of the call sign Dragon 6 and the man behind it. And in the years to come, when they spoke of heroes, they would always remember the man who had earned his place among them, not through titles or medals, but through actions that spoke louder than anything else. I can still feel the tension from that moment. The weight of the silence in the room hung thick after General Alexander's words. The Marines around James, their respect now undeniable, stood frozen in place, unable to look away. They had never expected the quiet janitor, who had spent years cleaning the hallways and floors, to be the legendary Dragon 6. James, on the other hand, had nothing left to prove. His life of quiet humility had always been about the men he served with, not the recognition that came afterward. As the general moved away from James and turned to the stunned group of Marines, his voice rang out. "Now, as for all of you," he said, his tone a sharp contrast to the calm reverence he had shown James, "you will remember this day. You will remember what it means to mock someone who has given more than you ever will." The Marines stood at attention, their eyes cast downward, acknowledging their mistake. The general continued, "You are not just part of this unit. You are part of a tradition. And that tradition means respect, honor, and duty, something you clearly have yet to understand." A heavy silence followed as the general's words sunk in. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the history in the room was too much to bear. Even the sound of distant helicopters and the usual chatter of the base seemed muffled, as if the world outside had paused to respect the moment. James remained standing, his posture unshaken. He knew the drill by now. He had lived through countless battles, seen men come and go, and watched as younger soldiers learn through the tough lessons of time. "Sir," James finally said, his voice steady but filled with the years of wisdom only a soldier who had lived through wars could possess, "I've done my part. I don't need anything more than this." He gestured to the Marines in front of him, who now stood silently, ashamed. The general nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I know you don't, James. But sometimes, we need to remind these younger generations what true sacrifice looks like." At that, he turned and looked at the soldiers who had mocked James just moments before. "You will train with respect, and you will carry yourselves with honor. If you have any doubts about what that means, I suggest you take a long look at this man standing here. He is the standard." The Marines, now fully aware of the magnitude of the situation, nodded in solemn agreement. The general's words were not just a reprimand, but a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As the general began to walk away, the petty officer, the same one who had mocked James earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "Sir, I didn't know." The general stopped, turning to face him. His eyes were piercing, but there was no malice in them, just the weight of experience. "You don't know yet," the general said, his tone softening slightly. "But you will. Just remember, there is more to being a soldier than the uniform you wear. It's the actions, the sacrifices, the integrity that defines you." The petty officer swallowed hard, clearly humbled. "Yes, sir." As the general and James made their way out of the area, the Marines remained behind, reflecting on the powerful lesson they had just received. The respect they had for James, and for the sacrifices he had made, would never be the same again. And in the years that followed, every time they heard the call sign Dragon 6, they would remember the man who had earned it not through titles or medals, but through actions that had forever shaped the military legacy. Meanwhile, James, the quiet janitor who had once been ignored and ridiculed, stood tall. The weight of his legacy was not in the medals on his chest or the recognition of his peers. It was in the quiet moments like this, when those who had once dismissed him learned the true meaning of respect. I apologize for the earlier mistakes. Let me now proceed with the next part of the story, ensuring it aligns with your requests and previous content. The base was quiet after the events of that morning. The hum of machinery and the usual chatter of soldiers felt distant, almost muffled, as though the weight of the lesson learned had settled into every corner of the facility. The younger Marines, who had once looked at James, the janitor, with dismissive eyes, now stood with a new understanding of who he was. The pride and arrogance that had fueled their mockery were replaced with something more profound: respect. They would never forget the moment when Dragon 6 had entered their lives, turning their assumptions upside down. But for James, the quiet janitor, the recognition was fleeting. He had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be celebrated. His place had always been with the men he had fought beside, the ones who knew his worth. He hadn't expected this, but as the day wore on, he returned to his familiar routine. He moved through the halls, sweeping, mopping, and cleaning as though nothing had changed. In his mind, the day's events weren't about glory or validation. They were about the bond he had formed with those soldiers all those years ago, the bonds forged in the heat of battle. Still, the respect shown to him by General Alexander and the Marines that day lingered in his heart, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a small spark of something he had not felt in years: pride. It wasn't the kind of pride that comes from recognition, but the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that you had lived a life worth respecting. Later that afternoon, As James was finishing up his work in one of the barracks, a young Marine approached him. The Marine was hesitant at first, unsure of how to address him after the events of the day. "Hey, sir," the Marine began, his voice a bit shaky. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier. I didn't know who you were. I was wrong to disrespect you." James stopped what he was doing and turned to face him. The Marine looked embarrassed, his eyes cast downward. "It's all right, son," James replied, his voice soft but steady. "I wasn't looking for an apology, but I appreciate it. We all learn from our mistakes." The Marine nodded, still feeling the weight of his actions. "I'm sorry, sir. I never expected you to be someone like that. I thought you were just a janitor." James smiled gently. It's easy to make assumptions when you don't know the whole story. But the important thing is that you learned something today. That's all any of us can ask for. The Marine's eyes brightened, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you, sir. I won't forget this." As the Marine walked away, James returned to his work, the quiet hum of the base once again enveloping him. It wasn't just the Marines who had learned from today's events. James had learned something too. He had learned that it was never too late to make a difference, that respect could be earned at any point in life, and that sometimes the greatest warriors were the ones who had fought the battles no one else could see. The day ended, and the base returned to its usual rhythm. But for those who had witnessed James's transformation from a janitor to a living legend, things would never be the same again. The lesson of Dragon 6 would stay with them, a reminder of the value of humility, sacrifice, and the quiet strength that defines true leadership. I can still feel the weight of the day as it continued to unfold on the military base. The respect that had been earned was not easily forgotten. James, the janitor, had returned to his quiet duties, but something had shifted in the air. His simple act of humility, standing tall and silent in the face of mockery, had left an impression that reverberated through the ranks. But it wasn't just the Marines who had learned something valuable that day. James, too, had been reminded of the importance of his own legacy. That night, as he walked through the empty halls of the barracks, a familiar sense of peace settled over him. The weight of the years, the battles, the men he had fought beside, all of it seemed to meld away in that quiet moment. He wasn't looking for praise, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his story had finally been heard. The next morning, as he made his way to the mess hall for his usual routine, something unexpected happened. A group of young Marines, who had once laughed at him, now stood in front of him with their heads bowed. They weren't just the Marines from earlier. They were a mix of soldiers from all ranks, their faces serious. The one who had mocked him the most, the petty officer, stepped forward hesitantly. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Sir, we just wanted to say thank you. For everything." The others nodded in unison, their expressions now filled with respect and gratitude. James looked at them, surprised, but his face softened. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "You've already done it by learning from this. Just remember, we all have a role to play, no matter where we are." The group stood in silence for a moment, absorbing his words. For them, it was a turning point, a moment when the true meaning of service had been brought to light. James smiled faintly before turning to leave. As he walked away, the Marines watched him, their eyes filled with a newfound understanding. In that moment, they realized that leadership didn't always come from the officers or the men with the highest ranks. Sometimes, the strongest leaders were the ones who carried their burdens quietly, who stood firm in the face of adversity, and who never asked for recognition. Later that afternoon, James found himself back in his usual spot, sweeping the barracks, cleaning the floors, maintaining the order of the base. But now, there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the routine he had come to accept, it was the knowledge that he had made a lasting impact. His legacy wasn't defined by the medals or titles he had earned during his time in service. It was defined by the men and women who had learned to respect him for who he truly was. The Marines who had once dismissed him now understood the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. James had shown them that leadership wasn't about flashy uniforms or impressive titles. It was about the quiet strength to lead by example, to do what needed to be done, even when no one was watching. And in the years to come, every time they passed him in the halls of the base, they would remember the lesson he had taught them. They would remember Dragon 6. They would remember the janitor who had earned more respect than any soldier in uniform. I apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. Let me now continue the story as requested. Weeks passed after the event at the base. The Marines, especially the ones who had once mocked James, found themselves transformed. Their sense of respect had grown, not just for James but for all those who served in silence, away from the spotlight. They learned a valuable lesson about leadership, humility, and the true meaning of sacrifice. But for James, life continued as usual. He woke up early every day, donned his work clothes, and began his rounds. He worked tirelessly, sweeping floors, mopping the hallways, and taking care of the small tasks no one else seemed to notice. To him, it wasn't about recognition. It never had been. The years of battle and hardship had shaped him into a man who knew that the real work was done in the shadows, far from the accolades. But even as he went about his daily routine, something had changed. The respect of the soldiers, the acknowledgement from the higher-ups. It made him realize that the legacy he had built was not one of glory or fame, but of impact. It was the kind of legacy that was passed down in quiet moments, in lessons learned, and in the ways people treated each other. One day, as James was cleaning one of the officers' lounges, he overheard a conversation between two young Marines. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but the words carried across the room. "I don't think I'll ever forget Dragon 6, one of them said. "That man, he's different. I didn't get it at first, but now I see it. He's the kind of man you'd follow anywhere." The other Marine nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I never thought a janitor would be the one to teach us what it really means to serve. He doesn't even talk about what he's done, but we all know. I think that's why we respect him." James felt a warmth spread through him as he finished his cleaning. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper, a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had never needed words of praise, but hearing them now, from these young Marines, made him realize that his actions had indeed made a difference. That afternoon, as he was about to leave the base for the day, General Alexander stopped by to check on him. The general had been visiting the base regularly, and every time he passed James, he would give him a respectful nod. Today was no different, but there was a new sense of purpose in his step. "James," the general called out, his voice carrying a tone of respect and warmth. "I wanted to personally thank you, not just for your service, but for the example you set." James turned to face the general, surprised. "I'm just doing my job, sir," James replied. The general smiled, but there was a serious look in his eyes. "Your job is much more than just cleaning. You've taught us all a lesson about humility, about sacrifice, and about what it means to be a true leader. It's an honor to serve with men like you." James didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to such praise. He simply nodded, grateful for the general's words, though he never expected them. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. The general clapped him on the shoulder. "You've earned more than you know. Rest assured, James, your legacy will never be forgotten here." With that, the general walked away, leaving James standing there, a sense of peace settling over him. As the days went by, life at the base returned to normal. The Marines continued their training, their work, and their routines, but they carried with them the lessons they had learned from James. They had learned that true leadership wasn't about the rank on your shoulder or the uniform you wore. It was about the strength of your character, the depth of your actions, and the humility with which you served. And as they moved forward, they did so with a newfound respect for all those who quietly carried the weight of their service, knowing that sometimes the greatest leaders were the ones who never sought the spotlight. James continued his work as usual, but every time he walked through the halls of the base, he felt a deep sense of pride, not because of the recognition, but because he knew that he had truly made a difference. His story, his legacy, would live on in the Marines who had once mocked him. And in the years to come, whenever they spoke of Dragon 6, they would remember the quiet janitor who had taught them the true meaning of service. I apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. Let me proceed with the continuation of the story as requested. Months passed, and James continued his quiet life at the base. Though his daily routine hadn't changed, something inside him felt different. The respect he had earned from the Marines and the general had given him a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. It wasn't about titles or recognition. It was about knowing that his actions, his service, had truly mattered. The Marines, who once saw him as nothing more than a janitor, now regarded him as a mentor, a living legend whose humility and sacrifice had left an indelible mark on their hearts. The lessons they had learned from him continued to shape their training and their approach to leadership. They understood now that it wasn't the medals or the ranks that defined a soldier. It was the strength of character and the willingness to lead by example. But for James, the journey wasn't over. There was one more lesson to be learned, and it would come in the most unexpected of ways. It was a quiet afternoon when James was called to the base commander's office. It was unusual for him to be summoned, and the thought of being interrupted from his work made him uneasy. When he arrived, he was greeted by the base commander, Colonel Stevens, a stern but respected officer. "James," the colonel began, his voice calm but serious, "there's something I need to discuss with you." James stood at attention, his usual humility in full force. "Yes, sir," he replied, unsure of what to expect. The colonel motioned for him to sit. "We've been reviewing the personnel records of everyone on base, including some of the men who've recently joined. Your name came up." James raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I don't understand, sir. My records are hardly anything to look at." The colonel chuckled softly. "That's exactly the point, James. You've been on this base for years, and yet, no one really knew your story. We've learned a lot about you since General Alexander's visit, and I have to admit, we've all been impressed." James shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything special, Colonel. I was just doing my job." The colonel looked at him seriously. "James, the truth is, your legacy has become an integral part of this base. The respect you've earned from the men here, it's not just about what you've done, it's about how you've lived. You've shown them what it means to serve with honor, with humility, and without expecting anything in return." James remained silent, unsure of how to respond. The colonel continued, "That's why I'm asking you for something. We have a special assignment coming up. It's not just any mission. It's one where we need someone with your unique skills. We need someone who's been through the hardest trials and has the wisdom to lead from the shadows." James looked at the colonel, surprised. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm the right man for this job." The colonel leaned forward. "You've already proven you have what it takes. This mission isn't about rank or glory. It's about the kind of leadership that can't be taught in a classroom. We need you, James." The request was unexpected, and for a moment, James was speechless. He had lived a life of quiet service, away from the front lines and the spotlight, never expecting to be asked for anything more. But as he sat there, reflecting on the colonel's words, he realized that this was the moment he had been preparing for all his life. It wasn't about the past, it was about what he could do now, for the next generation of soldiers who needed a leader who didn't need to be in charge, but simply needed to lead. "I'll do it, Colonel," James said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever you need." The colonel smiled. "I knew you would." A few weeks later, James found himself once again in the midst of military action, this time not as a janitor, but as a key figure in an operation that required the quiet strength of a true leader. The mission was delicate, and it required careful planning and precision. James was called upon not to command, but to guide and advise. His experience, his calm under pressure, and his ability to see the bigger picture made him an invaluable asset to the operation. As the mission unfolded, it became clear that James was exactly what the soldiers needed. His presence, though quiet, was a stabilizing force. He didn't need to raise his voice or make grand speeches. He led with actions, with decisions made in the heat of the moment, and with the respect that had been earned over years of selfless service. When the mission was successfully completed, James returned to the base with a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He had simply done what needed to be done. The Marines who had once looked down on him now saw him not just as a janitor, but as a mentor, a leader, and a living legend. The legacy of Dragon 6 would continue to inspire them, reminding them that true leadership comes from within, and sometimes, the greatest leaders are the ones who lead from the shadows. I apologize for the earlier confusion. Let me now proceed with Part 8 as per your instructions. Weeks passed since James's involvement in the special mission, and though the dust had settled, the impact of his quiet leadership still lingered on the base. The Marines who had once mocked him now respected him, and that respect spread through the ranks like wildfire. But even with the new recognition, James remained the same humble man, continuing his work in the shadows, where he had always felt most comfortable. He spent his days tending to the base's cleanliness, never asking for anything more than a simple thank you from the men and women he had served beside. But life had a way of bringing him into the spotlight once again. It was a cold morning when the base was put on high alert. A situation had developed that required every soldier's attention. The base's emergency operations center buzzed with activity as commanders and officers worked to assess the threat. It was a scenario unlike any the base had faced before, a tactical situation that called for quick decision-making and flawless execution. Colonel Stevens, the base commander, was overseeing the operation when he realized they needed someone with more experience, someone who had seen it all before. As the young officers discussed their plans, Colonel Stevens stood still, thinking. The mission required a leader with calm under pressure, someone who didn't just know how to follow orders, but how to make the right calls in life-and-death situations. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone. "Get James," the colonel ordered. "We need him here now." James had never expected to be called on again for something like this. He had done his part and felt content with the work he had done, but the colonel's call was not something he could ignore. Within minutes, James was at the command center, standing with the officers who had once dismissed him. He was no longer just the janitor. He was a trusted leader who had been called upon to guide them in their most critical moment. "James," Colonel Stevens greeted him as he walked into the room. "We need your insight." James nodded silently, already sensing the gravity of the situation. He had been through enough combat to understand when a situation was about to escalate. The young officers in the room looked at him, some with uncertainty in their eyes. They had never seen him like this before, calm, composed, and unflinching in the face of impending danger. They had only seen the man who cleaned the hallways and took care of the small tasks no one else wanted to do. But now, they were seeing the man who had earned the call sign Dragon 6, the man who had survived countless battles, faced down death, and walked away with nothing but the scars to show for it. James took a deep breath and surveyed the situation. He could see the tension in the room, the fear that none of the officers dared to speak about. This was a critical moment, and every decision mattered. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew the first rule: stay calm. "We have a plan," one of the officers began, his voice wavering slightly. "But we need someone who knows how to execute it under pressure." James looked around the room, his eyes locking with each officer's in turn. "The plan's only as good as the man who leads it," he said, his voice low but firm. The room fell silent. James's words hit home. The officers nodded, understanding the truth in his statement. This wasn't about strategy or tactics. It was about leadership, the kind that couldn't be learned in a classroom. "What do you suggest?" Colonel Stevens asked. James surveyed the situation once more, then turned back to the officers. "First, we secure the perimeter. Then, we use the terrain to our advantage. We don't need a full-scale assault. We need precision, speed, and intelligence. And above all, we need to stay calm." The officers looked at him, amazed at how he had taken control of the situation with such ease. It was clear now that James wasn't just a janitor. He was a man who had lived through it all and learned the most important lesson of all: the ability to remain composed when everything else was falling apart. "Get it done," James added, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. The officers immediately sprang into action, following James's orders with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. As they prepared for the mission, James stood at the center of the command room, watching over everything with a quiet sense of authority. He had become the leader they needed. Hours later, the mission was successfully completed, and the base was safe once again. The Marines who had once dismissed him as nothing more than a janitor now recognized him for what he truly was: a man of extraordinary courage and wisdom. James returned to his usual duties, never seeking recognition, never asking for praise. But as he walked through the halls, he knew that the legacy he had built, one of humility, sacrifice, and leadership, would never be forgotten. The base had changed, and so had the men who served there. They had learned from the quiet janitor who had taught them what it truly meant to serve with honor, and they would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. I apologize for the previous confusion. Let me now proceed with Part 9, ensuring the continuity and alignment with the previous sections as requested. As the months continued to pass, the base had transformed in ways that none of the soldiers, including James, could have ever anticipated. The respect that had been slowly earned by the quiet janitor was now fully ingrained in the culture of the base. No one would ever again dismiss him as just a janitor. In fact, it became a running joke among the Marines. When someone was unsure of themselves, they'd be told to ask James. The power of his leadership, demonstrated in the most subtle ways, had touched everyone. But James, true to his nature, never asked for recognition. His role at the base was always clear. He was there to help, to serve, and to lead without the need for fame or glory. His job was still to clean, still to make sure the soldiers had what they needed, still to maintain the base's order. But this time, he wasn't just maintaining the base physically. He was helping to maintain its heart and soul. On one particularly crisp autumn morning, as James walked through the barracks, he was called into the commander's office once again. Colonel Stevens had been very supportive of James ever since the special mission, and the change in the base's atmosphere was largely attributed to James's influence. The colonel greeted him with a firm handshake. "James, I need to speak with you about something important." James, used to his quiet life, nodded respectfully. "Of course, Colonel. What's the matter?" Colonel Stevens motioned for him to sit. "We're having a ceremony soon to honor the Marines who've served here, those who have made the ultimate sacrifice, and those who have demonstrated extraordinary leadership. We would like you to be the guest of honor." James blinked in surprise. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand. I'm just a janitor, sir. There are men who have done far more than I ever could." The colonel smiled, a deep, knowing smile. "James, that's exactly why you're the one we want. You represent something greater than just the uniform, greater than just the accolades or medals. You represent what it truly means to serve. You've taught these men what leadership really is. And that, James, is worth honoring." James didn't know what to say. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of praise, and part of him still felt uncomfortable with it. "I appreciate the sentiment, sir, but I don't think I should be the one to receive this honor. There are others who have done more than I could ever imagine." The colonel placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You've done more than you realize. You've impacted every man here in a way that no amount of combat or rank could ever achieve. It's not about what you've done in the past. It's about the legacy you've created, the respect you've earned, and the example you've set." James felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this, but somewhere deep inside, he knew the colonel was right. Over the years, he had given so much of himself to those he served with. And now, it seemed, they were giving back to him in a way that he had never imagined. The ceremony was held in the evening, just as the sun was setting and the air began to cool. The soldiers stood in neat rows, their faces serious, their respect for James evident in their posture. James stood at the front of the room, slightly awkward but humbled. He had never been the center of attention before, and he wasn't used to it now. Colonel Stevens stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "We are gathered here tonight to honor not only those who have made the ultimate sacrifice, but those who have shaped the very soul of this base. There is one man here who embodies the spirit of leadership, of service, and of sacrifice, without ever asking for anything in return. James, your legacy is far beyond what you can imagine. On behalf of every man and woman who has served here, we thank you." With that, the colonel presented James with a plaque, a simple yet meaningful tribute. The plaque read, "In honor of James, Dragon 6, a true leader who taught us all the meaning of service." James took the plaque in his hands, overwhelmed by the gesture. He had never expected this, and yet, here it was. The respect he had earned, not through any grand gestures, but through his quiet, unwavering commitment, had been recognized by the very people who once ignored him. As the ceremony continued, James didn't say much. He simply stood there, absorbing the gratitude from the men he had served beside. He wasn't a man of many words, but the silent exchange of respect spoke volumes. And for the first time, he felt a sense of pride, not in the plaque, not in the recognition, but in knowing that he had made a difference. That night, as the ceremony concluded and the soldiers began to file out, one of the Marines approached him. It was the same petty officer who had once mocked him. "James," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "I just wanted to say thank you. You've taught us all something we could never have learned without you. You're the real hero here." James smiled, his heart full. "I'm not a hero, son. I'm just someone who did what needed to be done." The petty officer nodded. "That's what makes you a hero in our eyes." As James walked back to his quarters that night, The cool autumn breeze felt different. It wasn't the wind that had changed, it was him. He had spent his life serving without ever expecting anything in return. And yet, in that moment, he knew that the respect he had earned from the soldiers around him was the greatest gift he could have ever received. I apologize for the previous confusion. Let me now continue with part 10 as per your instructions. The base had been quiet for a while, but even in the calm, there was an underlying tension. The kind of tension that comes from knowing something big is on the horizon, but not knowing exactly when it will arrive. James, now fully respected by every man on the base, continued with his daily duties. He didn't seek recognition, but it came in waves. Every Marine who passed him would nod in acknowledgement, sometimes with a simple "sir," other times with a more respectful "thank you, sir." The respect he had earned, though unspoken at first, had now become part of the fabric of the base itself. One afternoon, as he was finishing up his work, a commotion stirred in the distance. It was unusual for the base to get busy in the middle of the day, but the rapid movements of soldiers and the hurried footsteps of officers heading towards the command center indicated something was about to happen. James didn't need to ask. He knew. Word had already started to spread that the base was going to be tested by a threat neither they nor anyone else had anticipated. Colonel Stevens, who had been James's strongest supporter, came to find him. "James," the colonel said, his voice grave, "we need your help again." James looked at the colonel, knowing this wasn't a request for cleaning duty. "What is it, sir?" James asked, his tone steady. "There's a situation," the colonel continued. "It's not on the base, but we've just received intel that a group of enemy combatants are planning to cross into our jurisdiction. We need to move quickly. Your experience, your understanding of tactics, it's needed now." James didn't flinch, his mind already beginning to process the situation. He had been in countless situations like this, but this time, things were different. The respect he had gained from the men and the knowledge he had passed down had prepared them, but now it was his turn to be the one leading them, even if only in the background. "I'll do what I can, sir," James said, his calm voice a sharp contrast to the growing tension around him. The colonel nodded. "You'll be with the operations team. We need someone who's been through the worst to guide us through this." James stood tall, his mind shifting into the mode he had once known so well. The soldier who knew what it meant to take charge, even when it wasn't about leading the front lines. It was about the decisions, the quiet power of knowing what needed to be done without the fanfare. As the plan took shape, James found himself alongside officers and soldiers who were younger, more experienced in modern combat, but lacking the one thing that could make or break the mission: wisdom. "Remember," James said as the team gathered around the map, "this isn't just about speed or firepower. It's about knowing the terrain, using the resources at our disposal, and staying silent when we need to. If they know we're coming, they'll be ready. We need to surprise them." The younger soldiers nodded, some unsure of how to process the quiet intensity of his words. It wasn't until they were out on the field that they saw what James meant. The mission was far from simple. The enemy wasn't large in numbers, but they were strategic, well-prepared, and ready to exploit any mistake. The team moved cautiously, guided by James's unflinching leadership. Every decision was made with purpose, every step calculated. As the operation unfolded, James's influence became evident. He didn't shout orders or demand attention. He simply made decisions, pointing to weak spots, noticing details others missed. His experience was the guide that led the Marines to success. The operation ended quickly, without the loud explosions or chaotic firefights that often marked such missions. It was a quiet, methodical victory. When the threat was neutralized, the Marines returned to base, and the same respect they had shown James in the days before now had a deeper meaning. They had learned, once again, that leadership wasn't about rank. It wasn't about who could shout the loudest or carry the most weapons. It was about the ability to stay calm, to think critically, and to lead by example, even from behind the scenes. That night, as James walked through the barracks, the Marines didn't look at him as just the janitor anymore. They looked at him as someone who had given them more than they could have imagined. And as he walked quietly through the halls, he knew that the legacy he had built wasn't one of grand gestures, but of quiet strength and humility, a strength that had guided them through the toughest of times. I apologize for the previous misunderstanding. Let me now continue with part 11 according to your instructions. The mission had been a success, and the base was once again safe. The Marines who had participated in the operation walked away from it with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a leader. They had learned from James that true leadership wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. It was about having the calm to make the right decisions, the wisdom to see the bigger picture, and the humility to know when to step back. James returned to his usual duties, but this time, there was a subtle change in how he was treated. The men who had once seen him as nothing more than a janitor now greeted him with respect, with a sense of admiration that went far beyond the simple thank yous they had once given. They knew, now, that James wasn't just a man who cleaned their barracks or swept the floors. He was a man who had seen it all, who had been through battles both on the field and in his personal life, and who had earned the right to be called a leader. As the weeks passed, James continued to lead in his quiet, unassuming way. The base had become a place where soldiers no longer needed to shout or fight to prove their worth. Instead, they knew that their actions would speak for them. They had learned that humility, honor, and respect were the true measures of a soldier. One day, as James was walking through the mess hall, he noticed a young Marine sitting alone at a table, looking lost in thought. It wasn't unusual for new recruits to feel out of place at first, but this one seemed different. He was staring at his tray of food, his eyes distant, as if the weight of something was on his mind. James approached him and sat down across from him, his usual quiet presence unassuming. "You all right, son?" James asked softly, breaking the silence. The young Marine looked up, surprised, but there was no hostility in his eyes, only uncertainty. "I'm fine, sir," he said, his voice low. "Just not sure if I belong here." James nodded slowly, understanding the feeling all too well. He had seen it in every new recruit, the doubt that crept in before they truly found their place. "I've seen that look before," James said, his tone reassuring. "You're not the only one who's felt like they didn't belong. But I can tell you this, if you're here, you belong. The fact that you're questioning it means you care, and that's what counts." The Marine didn't say anything at first, but he seemed to appreciate the quiet wisdom in James's words. After a long pause, he finally spoke again. "I'm just worried I won't be able to keep up. I'm not like the others." James gave him a small smile. "None of us are like the others. But that's what makes you important. You bring something unique to the table. Don't worry about being like everyone else. Just focus on being the best version of yourself." The Marine looked at James, his expression softening. "Thanks, sir. I'll try." James stood up, giving the Marine a nod of approval. "You'll do fine, son. Just remember, it's not about the uniform you wear or the job you're given. It's about how you carry yourself and the decisions you make. Stay humble, and you'll earn the respect of everyone around you." As James walked away, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had been a mentor to so many, and now, even in his later years, he continued to guide those who needed it most. His journey had never been about recognition, but about making a difference in the lives of those who followed him. His legacy, once unknown to the Marines, was now firmly established. They didn't need plaques or medals to honor him. They honored him every day by following the lessons he had taught them. Days turned into weeks, and the base grew stronger, its soldiers more unified. They had learned that leadership wasn't about commanding others. It was about lifting them up, showing them the way, and guiding them through their struggles. And as for James, he continued his duties, content in the knowledge that he had done his part. He had shown the Marines that being a leader wasn't about titles or recognition. It was about the quiet strength to do what needed to be done, without question. James was no longer just a janitor. He was a living legend, one whose lessons would live on in the hearts and minds of those he had served with. And as the base continued to grow, so did the respect and admiration for the man who had taught them the true meaning of service. I apologize for the earlier confusion. Let me now continue with part 12 as per your instructions. James had always considered his time at the base as part of his quiet service to others, but he began to realize that the impact he had made went far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The Marines, once indifferent to him, now sought his guidance, looking up to him as a mentor and a living testament to the strength of character and humility. With each passing day, the respect for him grew deeper, not just among the enlisted men, but also among the higher-ups, who had once been unaware of his extraordinary history. The base had transformed, and so had James's role in it. He had taught them not just how to fight or survive, but how to lead with humility, how to serve without expecting recognition, and how to find strength in quiet resolve. But even as the Marines continued their training, as they moved forward with their missions, James knew that his time was running short. He had given everything to the service, and now, after all these years, he could feel the weight of age catching up with him. It wasn't something he was afraid of, but he could sense it. His joints ached more than they used to, his steps slowed, and the years of wear on his body were starting to show. Yet, he didn't let it stop him. He continued his duties just as he always had, never complaining, never slowing down. It wasn't about what he could no longer do. It was about the legacy he had already built. One quiet afternoon, as he was finishing up his rounds in the mess hall, Colonel Stevens approached him. James had always respected the colonel, and the feeling was mutual. Stevens had been the one to recognize James's true value from the beginning. "James," the colonel said, his voice steady but with a note of concern, "I need to talk to you about something." James looked up from his work, brushing his hands together. "What is it, sir?" he asked, his tone calm. "I've been thinking a lot about the changes on this base," the colonel began. "How far we've come, how much we've learned. And it all comes back to you. The way you've led us, even without ever wearing a rank. It's something special." James felt a warmth spread through him, but he nodded, knowing exactly what the colonel was referring to. "I've always just done my part, sir," he replied quietly. "I never asked for recognition. I'm here because it's the right thing to do." Colonel Stevens smiled softly. "You've done more than just your part, James. You've changed the way we see leadership, and you've made a lasting impact. You've shown us that real leadership is about service, humility, and knowing when to stand firm." There was a pause, and James could see the sincerity in the colonel's eyes. "I think it's time for you to take a step back, James. You've earned your rest. It's not that we want you to leave. We just want you to know that you don't have to keep pushing yourself so hard. You've given everything, and now it's time for us to carry the lessons you've taught us forward." The words hit James like a wave. It wasn't that he had been pushing himself for recognition, but there was something deeply humbling about hearing them. He had spent his life serving, never asking for anything in return, and now, the men he had served with were asking him to take a step back. James wasn't sure how to respond at first, but then, as he looked around the base, the men, the soldiers who had become family, he understood. His time had come, not to leave, but to simply rest. He had passed on everything he could. "Thank you, Colonel," James said softly, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "But I'm not going anywhere. Not yet. There's still work to do." The colonel understood and simply nodded, knowing that James was not the kind of man to walk away from what needed to be done. "Of course, James," he said, his voice warm. "Just know that you've already given more than any of us could ever repay." The next day, James returned to his usual routine. He continued his work in the barracks, cleaned the floors, and made sure everything was in order. But now, he did it with a sense of peace that he hadn't had before. The Marines who passed by greeted him with more than just respect. They acknowledged the legacy he had built. James didn't need a plaque or a ceremony. The respect he had earned from the men and women who served alongside him was enough. He knew that his time, his legacy, would live on through them. The lessons he had taught would continue to guide them long after he was gone. And when the time did come for him to leave the base, it wouldn't be with sorrow or regret. It would be with the knowledge that he had made a difference, that he had led in the way that mattered most, and that the Marines would continue to carry forward the values he had instilled in them. James had found something far greater than medals and titles. He had found the respect of those who mattered most, his brothers and sisters in arms. I apologize for the earlier confusion. Let me now proceed with part 13 as per your instructions. As the days passed, the atmosphere on the base continued to evolve. The respect that James had earned, not through medals or flashy titles, but through his quiet strength and steady leadership, remained firmly ingrained in the hearts of those who served there. The Marines, once unaware of the true essence of leadership, now carried the lessons he had taught them. They had learned that true leadership wasn't about commanding from the front. It was about leading by example, serving selflessly, and earning respect through actions rather than words. The base became a stronger, more united place because of what James had instilled in its people. James himself, however, had not changed in any grand way. He remained the same quiet janitor who had walked the base for years, But now there was a sense of peace in his heart that had not been there before. He had given everything to the service, and in return, the Marines had given him something even more valuable: respect, gratitude, and the knowledge that his legacy would live on. One morning, James found himself standing at the edge of the base, looking out over the horizon as the sun began to rise. The familiar sound of helicopters in the distance, the hum of machinery, and the distant chatter of soldiers filled the air. He stood there for a long time, simply watching the world around him. He had seen so much in his life: battles, sacrifices, loss, and yet, he had never expected to find a sense of peace like this. The base was his home, and the men and women who served there were his family. He had done his part, and now, it was time to let them carry forward the lessons he had taught them. It wasn't about stepping away or leaving. It was about knowing that the future was in good hands. A few days later, the base held a final ceremony to honor James. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was meaningful. The Marines who had come to respect him and the officers who had once relied on him stood together in a small gathering. They didn't need speeches or elaborate tributes. What they needed was to acknowledge what James had done for them and what they had learned from him. Colonel Stevens, who had been with James from the beginning, stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "James," he began, "I don't have words that could properly express what you've meant to this base, to this unit, and to me personally. You've taught us more than any of us could have imagined, and your influence will remain with us for as long as we serve." The Marines stood in respectful silence, their eyes focused on James, who stood among them. He didn't speak, but there was a quiet strength in his presence. James had never been one for speeches, and he wasn't about to start now. His eyes scanned the faces of the soldiers, young and old, officers and enlisted, and he felt a deep sense of pride. He hadn't needed to say anything. His actions had spoken for him. The ceremony ended with a simple gesture. The men and women of the base gave James a salute, something that went beyond formality. It was a tribute to the man who had taught them the true meaning of service. As the base returned to its usual rhythm, James continued his duties for a little while longer, but now, there was a sense of closure. He had done his part, and he had done it well. He had shown the Marines that it wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about the quiet strength to do what needed to be done, to lead without expecting anything in return. And as the years passed, when the Marines spoke of the legendary Dragon 6, they wouldn't remember him for his rank or his medals. They would remember him for the lessons he had taught them: the importance of humility, the value of leadership by example, and the power of quiet strength. James's legacy would continue to inspire those who followed him, long after he had passed on from this world. For James, that was enough. He had lived a life of service, and in the end, it was the respect of those he had served with that mattered most. He didn't need recognition. He had already earned the greatest reward, the knowledge that he had made a difference. And so, as he quietly walked away from the base one final time, James knew that his story, the story of Dragon 6, would never truly end. It would live on in the hearts and minds of the Marines he had served beside, inspiring them to lead with honor, humility, and strength, just as he had done.